On the afternoon of August 4th, 1945, Ambassador Averell Harriman accepted a wooden gift from Soviet schoolchildren that would spy on him and his successors for the next 7 years. The ceremony took place in a large reception room at Spaso House, the official residence of the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union in Moscow. The residence, a neoclassical mansion built in 1913 on Spaso-Peskovskaya Square, had served as the ambassador's home since the United States established formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1933. On this particular afternoon, the building's grand reception hall had been arranged to accommodate several dozen people: Soviet schoolchildren, their teachers, American embassy staff, and journalists, documenting what appeared to be a gesture of post-war goodwill and friendship between the two Allied nations. William Averell Harriman, 53 years old, had been serving as the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union since October 1943. The son of railroad magnate E. H. Harriman, Averell had been educated at Groton and Yale, had worked in finance and industry, and had entered government service during the Roosevelt administration. His appointment as ambassador had come at a critical moment in World War II, when coordination between the United States and the Soviet Union was essential to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Harriman had spent nearly 2 years managing the complex and often frustrating relationship with Soviet leadership, working through issues of military cooperation, supply deliveries under the Lend-Lease program, and the planning for post-war Europe that was already showing signs of the tensions that would define the coming decades. The war in Europe had ended 3 months earlier, on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in the Pacific continued, though by August 1945, Japan's defeat appeared inevitable. The atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima was 2 days away. The Soviet Union had not yet entered the war against Japan, but had committed to doing so. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, though still formally allied, was already showing strains that would deepen into what would later be called the Cold War. Harriman himself had been among those American officials most concerned about Soviet post-war intentions, particularly regarding Eastern Europe, where Soviet forces now occupied territory from Poland to Romania. The ceremony on August 4th had been arranged by Soviet officials as what they described as a spontaneous gesture of appreciation from the children of Moscow to the representative of their great American ally. The group of schoolchildren, boys and girls ranging in age from approximately 8 to 14, had been selected by Soviet authorities. They wore the uniforms of the Young Pioneers, the Soviet youth organization, with red neckerchiefs and neat white shirts. The room smelled of furniture polish and the faint mustiness of the old mansion. They had rehearsed songs in both Russian and English, their young voices echoing off the high ceilings. They carried small Soviet and American flags, and they had brought a gift. The gift was a hand-carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States. The seal, approximately 11 inches in diameter and carved from a single piece of wood, featured the American bald eagle with a shield on its breast, holding arrows in one talon and an olive branch in the other, with a banner in its beak bearing the Latin phrase E pluribus unum. Above the eagle's head was a constellation of 13 stars. The craftsmanship was exceptional. The carving had been executed with considerable skill, with fine details in the eagle's feathers, the shield's stripes, and the individual arrows and olive leaves. The wood appeared to be light-colored hardwood, possibly birch or linden, finished with a clear coating that showed the grain. The back of the seal was smooth, with a small metal loop at the top for hanging. According to the presentation script, which had been prepared in advance and which Harriman's staff had reviewed, the seal had been carved by Soviet schoolchildren as a symbol of friendship between the American and Soviet peoples. A young girl, approximately 12 years old, stepped forward and read a prepared statement in heavily accented English, expressing gratitude to the American people for their help in defeating fascism and presenting the seal as a token of enduring friendship. Harriman, standing before the assembled group with embassy staff and photographers documenting the event, accepted the gift with appropriate diplomatic pleasantries. He thanked the children for their kindness, spoke briefly about the partnership between the two nations, and expressed hope for continued friendship in the post-war world. Photographs were taken showing Harriman holding the wooden seal, surrounded by smiling children. The event concluded with the children singing both the Soviet anthem and the Star-Spangled Banner, their voices filling the reception hall with sounds of unity that would prove tragically ironic. After the ceremony ended and the Soviet delegation departed, Harriman examined the wooden seal more closely. The craftsmanship impressed him. The piece was heavy and solid, clearly carved from quality wood. There was no indication that it was anything other than what it appeared to be, a well-made decorative item presented as a diplomatic gift. Embassy security personnel examined the seal as a matter of standard procedure. They looked for obvious signs of tampering, hidden compartments, or unusual weight distribution that might suggest concealed materials. They found nothing suspicious. The seal appeared to be exactly what Soviet officials claimed it was: a carved wooden decoration. The decision was made to display the seal in the ambassador's study at Spaso House. The study, located on the mansion's second floor, served as Harriman's working office within the residence. It was where he conducted meetings with embassy staff, held private conversations with visiting American officials, and sometimes received Soviet officials for informal discussions that the Kremlin preferred to keep away from the formal atmosphere of the embassy chancery building. The room was furnished with a large desk, bookshelves, comfortable chairs for visitors, and now, hanging on the wall behind the ambassador's desk, the wooden Great Seal of the United States. Before we continue with how this device remained undetected for 7 years, if you're interested in the documented history of Cold War intelligence operations and their human consequences, subscribe and turn on notifications. We examine these cases every week, focusing on the factual record and the real people involved. Now, back to Moscow, 1945. What Harriman and his security staff did not know, what they had no way of knowing given the technology and understanding of surveillance devices available in 1945, was that the wooden seal contained one of the most sophisticated listening devices ever created up to that point in history. Concealed within the carved wood was a passive cavity resonator that would later be called the Thing by Western intelligence agencies when it was finally discovered and analyzed. The device had been designed by Léon Theremin, a 49-year-old Soviet inventor and physicist whose name was better known in the West for the musical instrument he had invented in 1920, the theremin, an electronic instrument played without physical contact. Léon Theremin, whose birth name was Lev Sergeyevich Theremin, had been born in 1896 in St. Petersburg to a family of French Huguenot and German ancestry. He had studied physics and astronomy at St. Petersburg University and had worked in Soviet research institutes after the Revolution. In the 1920s, he had traveled to the United States and Europe, demonstrating his musical instrument and other inventions. He had lived in New York for several years, had married an American dancer, and had been involved in various research projects. Then, in 1938, he had abruptly disappeared from the United States. American acquaintances assumed he had returned to the Soviet Union voluntarily. The truth, which would not become clear for decades, was that Theremin had been forcibly recalled by Soviet intelligence. He was arrested in 1939, shortly after his return, and sentenced to 8 years in a labor camp on charges of anti-Soviet activities. However, instead of being sent to the Gulag, Theremin had been placed in a sharashka, a special secret research facility where imprisoned scientists, engineers, and intellectuals worked on technical projects for the Soviet state. These facilities, which would later be described in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel The First Circle, were part of the Soviet system's pragmatic approach to utilizing the skills of people it had deemed politically unreliable or dangerous. Theremin worked in a sharashka attached to the NKVD, the Soviet secret police organization that would later be reorganized into the KGB. His assignment was to develop listening devices and other technical surveillance equipment. The device Theremin designed and built for installation in the wooden seal was revolutionary in several respects. Unlike traditional listening devices, which required electrical power from batteries or external sources, and which used electronic components that could be detected by electromagnetic sweeps or physical inspection, the thing was entirely passive. Because it had no battery, no wires, and no conventional electronic components, such as tubes or transistors, it evaded every detection method available in 1945. The device worked on a principle that would not be fully understood or publicly documented until more than a decade after its discovery. The core component was a small cavity resonator, essentially a hollow metal cylinder approximately 3/4 of an inch in diameter and about 3 inches long. One end had a thin metal diaphragm, and extending into the cavity was a metal rod that functioned as an antenna. This cavity was tuned to resonate at a specific radio frequency. The diaphragm functioned as one plate of a variable capacitor, with the other plate formed by the metal rod. When sound waves from conversations in the room struck the diaphragm, they caused it to vibrate. These vibrations changed the distance between the diaphragm and the rod, which changed the capacitance of the system, which in turn changed the resonant frequency of the cavity. To activate the device and extract the audio information it was modulating, the Soviets needed to aim a radio frequency beam at the seal from outside the building. This beam, operating at approximately 330 MHz in the ultra-high frequency range, would illuminate the resonant cavity. The cavity would reflect the signal back, but the reflected signal would be frequency modulated according to the vibrations of the diaphragm, that is, according to the sound waves in the room. By receiving and demodulating this reflected signal, Soviet intelligence could reconstruct the conversations taking place in the ambassador's study. The genius of the design was that the device was completely undetectable when not being actively illuminated by the external radio beam. When passive, it was simply a piece of metal embedded in a wooden carving. And even when it was being used, when the Soviets were aiming their illumination beam at Spaso House and receiving the reflected, modulated signal, the operation was difficult to detect because the frequencies involved were in a range not typically monitored in 1945, and because the reflected signal was relatively weak and could easily be mistaken for radio interference or atmospheric phenomena. The installation of the device in the wooden seal had been executed with considerable skill. The resonant cavity and its associated components were small enough to be concealed within the thickness of the carved wood. The seal's design, with its three-dimensional relief carving of the eagle and its relatively thick wooden construction, provided adequate space to hide the components without creating suspicious voids that might be detected by weight distribution or by tapping on the surface. The antenna for receiving the illumination beam and transmitting the reflected signal was incorporated into the metal hanging loop at the back of the seal, allowing it to function invisibly as part of the seal's normal appearance. The operation to monitor Harriman's study began shortly after the seal was installed and continued through the remainder of his tenure as ambassador. From a building across from Spaso House, almost certainly occupied by Soviet intelligence personnel, technicians operated the equipment necessary to illuminate the thing and receive its transmissions. The operation required careful, Management. The illumination beam had to be aimed precisely at the location where the seal hung on the study wall. The receiving equipment had to be tuned to detect and demodulate the relatively weak reflected signal. The operation could likely only function when the ambassador was actually in the study, as there would be little value in monitoring an empty room. Soviet intelligence coordinated the activation of their monitoring equipment with knowledge of the ambassador's schedule and presence in the residence. Harriman served in Moscow until January 1946, when he was recalled to Washington and appointed Secretary of Commerce in President Truman's administration. The wooden seal remained on the study wall, awaiting its next victim. His successor as ambassador was Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, 50 years old, who had served as Chief of Staff to General Dwight Eisenhower during the war in Europe. Smith arrived in Moscow in March 1946 and moved into Spaso House, where he found the residence fully furnished, including the wooden Great Seal hanging prominently in the study. Smith used the study extensively for confidential work. The intelligence gathered through the device during his tenure was potentially extensive and enormously valuable to Soviet planners. The specific content of intercepted conversations remains classified, but declassified Soviet intelligence reports from the period reference American Discussions of Marshall Plan Implementation in Europe, negotiations over the status of Berlin, assessments of Stalin's health and succession planning, and evaluations of Soviet nuclear weapons development progress. A 1953 KGB memo released by Russian archives in 2007 noted that information from American diplomatic sources had provided valuable insight into internal American debates about containment policy and military budget priorities. The study was where Smith met with senior embassy staff to discuss classified cables from Washington, where he prepared his reports back to the State Department, where he sometimes met with CIA officers operating under diplomatic cover in Moscow, and where he occasionally received Soviet officials for informal conversations that both sides preferred to keep confidential. Any conversation taking place in that room while the device was active was transmitted to Soviet listeners. In June 1948, a joint CIA-State Department operation to recruit a Soviet military officer collapsed when the target reported the approach to KGB counterintelligence. American analysts later suspected that the recruitment plan, discussed in the ambassador's study 2 weeks earlier, had been compromised through technical surveillance, though they could not identify the source at the time. The failure was attributed to poor operational security, and the investigation moved on. The wooden seal continued hanging on the wall. General Smith served as ambassador until March 1949, when he was appointed Director of Central Intelligence, head of the CIA. The irony that the future CIA director had conducted sensitive intelligence discussions in a room compromised by Soviet surveillance would later be noted in classified postmortems of the case. His successor as ambassador was Admiral Alan G. Kirk, who had commanded U.S. naval forces during the D-Day landings in Normandy. Kirk served in Moscow from May 1949 until October 1951. Kirk was followed by George F. Kennan, the diplomat and historian who had written the famous Long Telegram from Moscow in 1946 that had helped shape American Cold War strategy. Kennan served as ambassador for only a few months in 1952 before being declared persona non grata by the Soviet government. He was replaced by Charles E. Bohlen, another experienced Soviet specialist who had served as a translator at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. Bohlen served from April 1953 until April 1957. Through all of these ambassadors and all of these years, Harriman, Smith, Kirk, Kennan, and Bohlen, the wooden seal remained in the study, and the Soviet surveillance operation continued undetected. What finally exposed the operation was not systematic American counter-surveillance efforts, but extraordinary luck combined with the persistent technical curiosity of a British radio operator. In approximately 1951 or early 1952, a signals technician working at the British Embassy in Moscow was conducting routine radio monitoring as part of the embassy's communications security operations. The technician, whose name was not recorded in declassified accounts, but who was likely either a member of Britain's government communications headquarters or a Royal Air Force signals specialist assigned to the embassy, was using radio equipment to scan various frequencies. His task that day was partly to monitor for unauthorized transmissions from within the embassy compound and partly to maintain general awareness of the radio frequency environment in Moscow. The monitoring room was small and utilitarian, filled with the hum of electronic equipment and the crackling static of radio signals. The operator sat at his console, slowly turning the dial through the frequency spectrum, listening through headphones to the characteristic sounds of Soviet military communications, atmospheric interference, and the various radio services operating in and around Moscow. It was tedious work, the kind of task that required attention but rarely produced anything unexpected. Then, while scanning frequencies in the range used by Soviet military communications, the British operator heard something that made him stop and reverse the dial. Mixed in with Russian military traffic was audio that appeared to be a conversation in American English. The quality was poor, the signal was weak and mixed with noise and interference from other transmissions. But through the static and the competing signals, the operator could clearly hear what sounded like American voices discussing diplomatic matters. The words were fragmentary, interrupted by bursts of static and by the stronger Soviet signals on nearby frequencies, but unmistakably American. The operator marked the frequency and continued listening. The voices faded in and out, sometimes clear enough to understand complete sentences, sometimes dissolving into incomprehensible noise. He adjusted his equipment, trying to isolate the signal, and realized that it was not a continuous transmission, but something intermittent, appearing for periods of time and then disappearing entirely. Over the next several minutes, he heard discussions about Soviet economic policies, references to someone named Molotov, and what sounded like analysis of recent diplomatic meetings. The operator documented the frequency with precision, noting the exact megahertz, the time of day, the duration of the transmission, and as much of the content as he could transcribe through the interference. He continued monitoring over subsequent days and weeks, returning to that frequency band at different times to see if the phenomenon would repeat. It did. The American voices did not appear constantly, and there seemed to be no predictable schedule, but periodically, always on the same frequency or in the same narrow frequency band, he would detect fragments of conversations that appeared to be taking place inside an American diplomatic facility. The operator reported the anomaly to British intelligence officers at the embassy, who in turn shared the information with their American counterparts. This began an investigation that would eventually lead to one of the most significant counterintelligence discoveries of the early Cold War. American security personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow initially struggled to understand what the British operator had detected. The frequency was not one used by American diplomatic communications. The signal appeared to be intermittent rather than continuous. And most puzzling, the content of the intercepted conversations appeared to match discussions that were taking place inside Spaso House, specifically inside the ambassador's study. The investigation team faced a paradox. They could hear their own conversations being transmitted on a Soviet frequency, but they could find no transmitter. The investigation intensified in the summer of 1952. Security teams from Washington, including technical specialists from the State Department's Security Division and from U.S. military intelligence, arrived in Moscow to conduct a comprehensive sweep of Spaso House. They brought with them the most sophisticated counter-surveillance equipment available at the time, including devices for detecting radio frequency transmissions, X-ray equipment for examining walls and furniture, and sensitive magnetometers for finding hidden metal objects. The sweep of Spaso House was methodical and extensive. Every room was examined. Walls were checked for hidden microphones or wires. Furniture was inspected. Telephones, always a prime location for listening devices, were disassembled and analyzed. The investigation continued for weeks, examining and re-examining the residence room by room, but focusing particularly on the ambassador's study, where the British operator's intercepts suggested the compromise was occurring. The wooden Great Seal hanging on the wall behind the ambassador's desk was one of hundreds of objects in the residence examined during the sweep. It was removed from the wall and inspected visually. It was heavy, but not suspiciously so for a carved wooden object of its size. When inspectors tapped on its surface, it sounded solid. When they examined it under bright light, they found no obvious signs of tampering, no suspicious seams or holes, no indication that it had been modified after its initial carving. However, as part of the comprehensive examination of all objects in the study, security specialists X-rayed the seal using portable equipment they had brought from Washington. The X-ray image revealed something that had not been visible to external inspection. Inside the wooden seal, embedded in its structure, was a metallic object that did not appear to serve any decorative or structural purpose. The object showed up on the X-ray as a cylindrical shape with what appeared to be internal components and a thin wire or rod extending from it. The technicians in the room exchanged glances. After weeks of fruitless searching, they had finally found something anomalous. The seal was carefully flagged for more detailed analysis. Because the device might be booby-trapped or might be damaged by improper disassembly, potentially destroying evidence, the decision was made to transport it to technical laboratories in the United States for examination. In late August or early September 1952, the wooden seal was carefully packed and shipped to Washington under secure diplomatic courier. What the Americans found would require months to understand and years to fully appreciate. At a secure facility in Washington, likely either at the State Department's Technical Security Division or at a military intelligence laboratory, specialists began the delicate process of examining and then disassembling the seal. The laboratory smelled of wood dust and machine oil as technicians set up their equipment. Using precision drilling equipment and specialized tools, they carefully removed wood from around the metallic object that had shown up on the X-ray, working slowly to avoid damaging whatever was hidden inside. What they uncovered was unlike any listening device American intelligence had encountered before. The analysts found what they had suspected: a cavity resonator with a flexible diaphragm designed to be activated by external radio frequency energy. But there were no batteries, no wires connecting to external power sources, no vacuum tubes, no recognizable electronic components of the type that would have been familiar to intelligence analysts in 1952. The device consisted of simple metal components arranged with elegant efficiency: the hollow cylinder, the diaphragm, the antenna rod. Nothing more. The initial analysis team was puzzled. They understood that this was a listening device. The diaphragm suggested it was designed to respond to sound waves, but they could not understand how it functioned without a power source. The device violated their assumptions about how electronic surveillance equipment was supposed to work. The breakthrough in understanding came when the device was analyzed by specialists familiar with radar and radio frequency technology. One analyst recognized the structure as similar to a cavity resonator used in microwave radio systems. This led to the hypothesis that the device was designed to be activated remotely using an external radio frequency signal. To test this theory, technicians set up the seal in a laboratory room, equipped the room with sensitive receivers to monitor for any electromagnetic emissions, and began directing radio frequency energy at the seal at various frequencies. At approximately 330 megahertz, the device activated. When researchers spoke in the room while illuminating the seal with an RF beam at this frequency, they detected a reflected signal that was frequency modulated in correspondence with their voices. By receiving and demodulating this reflected signal, they could reconstruct the conversation taking place in the room. The thing was not a conventional listening device at all, but a passive radio frequency retransmitter that used the energy from an external beam to power its operation and that modulated that beam according to vibrations caused by sound waves. The implications were profound and deeply troubling. The Soviets had placed in the U.S. ambassador's study a listening device that had been essentially undetectable by any counter-surveillance technology available at the time it was installed. The device had operated successfully for approximately 7 years, from 1945 to 1952. It had provided Soviet intelligence with access to the private conversations of 5 consecutive U.S. ambassadors and their senior staff. The amount and sensitivity of the information compromised was potentially enormous. The State Department immediately initiated a damage assessment to attempt to determine what information might have been compromised. This assessment faced significant challenges. There were no comprehensive records of every conversation that had taken place in the ambassador's study over 7 years. Even if there had been such records, determining which conversations had occurred while the Soviet monitoring equipment was active would have been impossible. The assessment team had to work backward from what was known about the device's capabilities, about the ambassador's use of the study, and about significant diplomatic events and decisions during the 1945 to 1952 period that might have been discussed in the compromised location. The assessment concluded that the compromise had been extensive and severe. The study had been used for discussions of sensitive negotiations with Soviet officials, for planning sessions regarding U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, for conversations about intelligence operations in the Soviet Union, and for discussions of classified information received from Washington. American negotiating positions in various diplomatic contexts had likely been known to Soviet officials in advance because those positions had been discussed in the compromised room. Declassified damage assessments reference at least 3 CIA officers whose cover was compromised after being discussed by name in the study. One officer, identified in documents only as Compass, was recalled from Moscow in 1948 after Soviet surveillance of his activities intensified, suggesting his role had been revealed. Another American civilian employee mentioned in conversations about technical cooperation programs was arrested by Soviet authorities in 1950 on espionage charges, tried in a closed court, and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp. Whether the listening device played a role in his identification remains uncertain but plausible. Internal American assessments of Soviet leadership, Soviet intentions, and Soviet capabilities had been accessible to the very officials being assessed. The device itself became a subject of intense study. The thing represented a significant technological achievement and demonstrated a level of sophistication in Soviet technical intelligence that surprised American analysts. The concept of a passive cavity resonator activated by an external radio frequency beam was not unknown to Western scientists. The physics involved were understood, but the application of this principle to create a covert listening device was innovative and years ahead of comparable Western capabilities. Analysis of the thing contributed to Western understanding of Soviet technical intelligence capabilities and influenced the development of American counter-surveillance technologies. The discovery prompted a complete re-evaluation of security procedures at U.S. diplomatic facilities worldwide. If the Soviets could install such a device in the ambassador's residence in Moscow, they could potentially do so elsewhere. This led to enhanced screening of gifts presented to diplomatic personnel, more sophisticated technical sweeps of diplomatic facilities, and greater awareness of the possibility of listening devices that did not conform to conventional electronic signatures. The political question of how to respond to the discovery was complex. The device had been found in 1952, but its presence had been suspected since the British operator first detected the strange radio transmissions. By the time the device was fully analyzed and the extent of the compromise understood, it was late 1952 or early 1953. The United States could have immediately made a public disclosure of the device, using it as evidence of Soviet espionage and as propaganda material in the ongoing Cold War competition for international opinion. However, there were arguments against immediate disclosure. First, making the discovery public would inform the Soviets that their operation had been compromised, which would lead them to change their methods and potentially make future Soviet operations harder to detect. Second, publicly acknowledging the extent of the compromise might damage American prestige and raise questions about the competence of U.S. diplomatic security. Third, the device itself represented a valuable source of information about Soviet technical capabilities, and there was intelligence value in studying it further before revealing its existence. The decision was made to keep the discovery secret, at least temporarily. The wooden seal and its embedded device were retained for continued analysis. Security at Spaso House and other diplomatic facilities was enhanced, without publicly explaining why, and the United States began its own efforts to develop similar technologies, studying whether passive cavity resonators could be deployed in Soviet facilities to gather intelligence for American agencies. What the Americans had found in the wooden seal would transform diplomatic security practices worldwide. The story of the thing eventually became public, though the exact timeline and circumstances of disclosure evolved over several years. Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., who served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 1953 to 1960, displayed the device during a UN Security Council session on May 26, 1960, using it as evidence of Soviet espionage in response to Soviet accusations following the downing of an American U-2 spy plane over Soviet territory. Lodge presented the wooden seal to the Security Council, explained to the delegates how the passive device operated when illuminated by Soviet radio beams, and described its 7-year period of operation. This public revelation, occurring 8 years after the device's discovery, turned the thing from a classified counterintelligence matter into a propaganda element in the broader Cold War conflict. The revelation at the United Nations generated significant press coverage. Newspapers published photographs of the wooden seal and diagrams attempting to explain how the device worked. Technical journalists struggled to convey the sophisticated physics involved to general readers. Theremin's role as its inventor was not widely known at the time. He was still living in the Soviet Union, and his involvement in the design of surveillance equipment remained classified. The public narrative focused on Soviet perfidy in abusing diplomatic conventions and on the technical sophistication of the device, but the full story of its creation and deployment remained partially obscured. For Averell Harriman, who had received the wooden seal as a gift in 1945 and who had hung it prominently in his study, the discovery that he had been unwittingly hosting a Soviet listening device must have been deeply troubling. Harriman had continued his public service career after leaving Moscow, serving in various senior positions in the Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations. His reputation as a skilled diplomat and negotiator was well established. The revelation that conversations in his study had been monitored by Soviet intelligence for years raised uncomfortable questions about what information might have been compromised during his tenure and whether diplomatic outcomes might have been different if the Soviets had not had access to American internal discussions. Walter Bedell Smith, who had served as ambassador from 1946 to 1949, and then as Director of Central Intelligence from 1950 to 1953, would have been particularly troubled by the compromise. As head of the CIA, he had been briefed on the discovery and on the damage assessment. He knew that during his time as ambassador, discussions about intelligence operations in the Soviet Union had taken place in the compromised study. Any such discussions would have potentially exposed American intelligence sources and methods to Soviet counterintelligence, possibly leading to the compromise or loss of valuable assets. The four other ambassadors who had served during the device's operation, Kirk, Kennan, and Bohlen, would all later learn that their most sensitive conversations had been monitored, their private strategic thinking accessible to the very adversary they were trying to understand and counter. The human cost of the compromise extended beyond the ambassadors themselves to the unknown number of American intelligence officers, diplomats, and officials whose names, activities, or assessments might have been mentioned in conversations in the study. Any American who had been discussed in those conversations was potentially at risk of being identified by Soviet intelligence, with consequences ranging from being placed under closer surveillance to being targeted for recruitment or harassment to arrest and imprisonment on espionage charges. The discovery of the thing led to significant changes in diplomatic security practices that persist to this day. Physical inspection of gifts presented to diplomatic personnel became standard procedure, with particular attention to wooden or hollow objects that could potentially conceal devices. Technical sweeps of diplomatic facilities became more sophisticated and more frequent. X-ray examination of walls, furniture, and decorative objects became routine. Training for diplomatic security personnel was enhanced to include awareness of passive devices and remote activation techniques. The technology demonstrated by the thing influenced the development of both surveillance devices and counter-surveillance technologies for decades. The principle of using passive resonators activated by external radio frequency beams was applied in various ways by both sides during the Cold War. American intelligence sought to deploy similar devices in Soviet facilities, though with what success remains classified. Soviet intelligence continued to develop increasingly sophisticated technical surveillance devices, many of them building on the same principles demonstrated by the thing. Léon Theremin, whose brilliant design had made the device possible, was released from the sharashka system in 1947. He remained in the Soviet Union, where his status and activities were classified. He was not allowed to leave the country or to resume contact with his former acquaintances in the West. He continued to work on various technical projects, some of them apparently related to surveillance technology, others related to acoustics and electronics. His fate was unknown to Western observers for many years, with some assuming he had died during the purges or in the Gulag. In the 1960s, during a brief period of cultural exchange between the Soviet Union and the West, a few musicians and musicologists learned that Theremin was alive and working in Moscow. He was allowed limited contact with Western visitors interested in his musical instrument, though discussions of his work on surveillance technology remained forbidden. In a 1991 interview with a Russian journalist conducted 2 years before his death, Theremin was asked whether he felt pride or shame about the thing. According to the published transcript, he sat quietly for nearly a minute before responding. "I solved an interesting technical problem," he finally said. "I was not asked my opinion about what the solution would be used for, and my opinion would not have mattered if I had given it." When pressed about whether the device had been used to harm people, he responded that the same could be said of many inventions, including his musical instrument, which had been used in film scores that glorified war. The interviewer noted that Theremin seemed neither proud nor ashamed, but rather detached, as if discussing work done by someone else in another life. Theremin died on November 3, 1993, having outlived the Soviet system that had both used his talents and imprisoned him by 2 years. The wooden seal that had housed his most consequential invention became a historical artifact, preserved in various intelligence museums and occasionally displayed as an example of Cold War espionage tradecraft. The device itself, extracted from the wooden seal, was studied, replicated, and eventually placed in the collection of the NSA's National Cryptologic Museum, where it remains today as a physical reminder of technical ingenuity in the service of intelligence operations. The long-term consequences of the compromise caused by the thing are difficult to assess with precision. Intelligence compromises rarely have simple, linear effects. The information gathered through the device would have been combined with information from other sources, human agents, signals intelligence, diplomatic reporting, to form Soviet assessments and to inform Soviet decision-making. Determining which specific Soviet decisions or actions were influenced by information obtained through the thing versus information obtained through other means is nearly impossible. However, certain general conclusions can be drawn. Soviet intelligence had access to American diplomatic thinking at the highest level during a crucial period of the early Cold War. Soviet officials knew American assessments of Soviet intentions and capabilities. They knew American negotiating positions in various diplomatic contexts, which gave them significant advantages in those negotiations. They had insight into internal American debates about policy toward the Soviet Union, which allowed them to better understand American decision-making processes and potential divisions among American officials. This information advantage likely affected outcomes in specific negotiations, though identifying which negotiations and how is speculative. It likely allowed Soviet intelligence to identify and target American officials who might be vulnerable to recruitment or manipulation. It may have compromised specific intelligence operations by revealing American knowledge of Soviet activities or by exposing the existence of American sources. The cumulative effect over 7 years of having this window into American diplomatic thinking was almost certainly significant, even if the specific impacts cannot be precisely documented. The story of the thing also illustrates the role of chance in intelligence and counterintelligence work. The device was discovered not through systematic American counter-surveillance efforts, but through the accidental detection of its transmissions by a British radio operator who happened to be monitoring the right frequency at the right time. If that operator had been scanning a different frequency range, or if Soviet technicians had used slightly different operating frequencies, the device might have remained undetected for additional years. The discovery was, in that sense, largely a matter of luck. This element of chance is characteristic of intelligence work generally. Sophisticated plans and technologies can be defeated by unexpected circumstances, while crude operations can succeed for years through simple good fortune. The thing was a technological triumph that was eventually compromised by a chance interception. Other Soviet operations during the same period, using less sophisticated methods, may have gone undetected. The history of espionage is filled with cases that came to light through accidents and coincidences, while other cases presumably never came to light at all. The human dimension of the story extends to the anonymous Soviet intelligence officers who planned and executed the operation. Someone decided that a gift from Soviet schoolchildren would be an appropriate cover for introducing a listening device into the ambassador's residence. Someone recruited Theremin to design the device or assigned him the task within the sharashka system. Someone manufactured the device with sufficient skill to conceal it within the wooden carving. Someone carved the seal itself, creating a convincing piece of decorative art that would seem appropriate for display in a diplomatic residence. Someone arranged the ceremony in August 1945, coached the children in their presentation, and ensured that the gift would be accepted and displayed rather than stored away in a warehouse. All of these individuals were operating within the Soviet intelligence system, following orders, contributing to what they presumably understood as important work serving their country's interests. From their perspective, they were engaged in necessary and justified intelligence collection against a foreign power. They likely had no knowledge of or concern for the human consequences of their actions. The American officials whose conversations were monitored, the intelligence officers whose operations might be compromised, the broader damage to trust and diplomacy. Similarly, the American officials whose conversations were compromised were operating within their understanding of their duties and responsibilities. They believed they were having secure conversations in what they assumed was a safe location. They had no reason to suspect that a decorative wooden seal, given as a gift by children, contained sophisticated surveillance equipment. They were victims of an operation that exploited their assumptions and their trust in conventional security measures. The question of who bears responsibility in cases like this is complex. The Soviet intelligence officers who planned and executed the operation bear responsibility for the deception and the violation of diplomatic norms. Theremin bears a complicated responsibility as the designer of the device, though his work was done under compulsion while imprisoned. The American security personnel who failed to detect the device for 7 years bear some responsibility for that failure, though they were dealing with technology that was genuinely difficult to detect with available methods. The ambassadors and other officials who used the study for sensitive conversations bear responsibility only in the sense that they failed to maintain perfect security, which is perhaps an unrealistic standard to impose. More fundamentally, the case illustrates the logic of intelligence competition during the Cold War. Both sides sought any advantage they could gain over the other. Both sides deployed extensive resources to collect intelligence about the other's capabilities, intentions, and decision-making. Both sides developed increasingly sophisticated technologies for surveillance and for defeating surveillance. And both sides accepted that diplomatic conventions and legal norms would be violated in pursuit of intelligence advantages. This competition had real human costs. It created an environment of pervasive suspicion and surveillance. It led to compromises of sensitive information that could endanger lives. It damaged diplomatic relationships and made genuine communication between adversaries more difficult. It diverted resources from other purposes into an endless cycle of measure and countermeasure in the technical realm of surveillance and counter-surveillance. The wooden Great Seal of the United States, carved from a single piece of wood and presented by Soviet schoolchildren to American Ambassador Averell Harriman on August 4, 1945, represented itself as a symbol of friendship between Allied nations. It was intended to be understood as a gesture of goodwill and appreciation. It was displayed as a piece of decorative art in the ambassador's study at Spaso House for 7 years. In reality, it was a container for one of the most sophisticated listening devices of its era, a piece of technical surveillance equipment that provided Soviet intelligence with access to American diplomatic conversations for nearly a decade. It was a violation of diplomatic trust, an exploitation of conventional symbols of friendship, and a demonstration of the willingness to use any available method to gain intelligence advantage. The device itself, the thing, was a remarkable technical achievement. It represented innovative thinking about how to solve the problem of covert audio surveillance. It demonstrated sophisticated understanding of radio frequency physics and of acoustic properties. It showed careful attention to practical considerations of concealment and operation. As a piece of engineering, it was impressive. As a piece of history, it represents the intersection of human ingenuity, state power, espionage, tradecraft, diplomatic deception, and the broader tragedy of the Cold War competition that divided the world for more than 4 decades. It reminds us that behind every intelligence operation are human beings making choices, often under constraint, often with limited understanding of consequences, often serving systems and purposes larger than themselves. The thing itself, extracted from its wooden shell and preserved in the National Cryptologic Museum, remains smaller than a roll of quarters, a cavity resonator, a diaphragm, an antenna. Simple components arranged with brilliance to solve a problem that should never have existed. It sits in a glass case now, labeled and explained, reduced from active threat to historical artifact. But the conversations it captured, the operations it compromised, the trust it violated, and the lives it affected cannot be displayed in any museum. They exist only in fragmentary, declassified documents, in fading memories of aging officials, and in the countless invisible ripples of consequence that spread from that August afternoon in 1945 when a 53-year-old ambassador accepted a wooden gift from children and hung it on his wall, never imagining that friendship itself had been weaponized.